1947, the second post-war year in the Soviet Union, was a jubilee. The country of the Soviets was preparing to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the October Revolution, which is known in the history of the USSR as the Great October Socialist Revolution. The day determined the subject of information messages and the purpose of Soviet propaganda. There were reports about national democratic reforms in countries that had presumably gained a victory of democracy. The fact that citizens that were taken away to Germany happily returned home, the celebration of the 800th anniversary of the founding of Moscow, and the beginning of monetary reform in the USSR. But those events that tragically ended for Ukraine went totally unnoticed. First of all, 1947 was the year of the start of a great famine, almost in all regions of Ukraine. The situation in the south of Ukraine was critical. Researchers said the post-war famine was not only a result of a coincidence of many factors. Among them were the destruction of the agricultural sector of Ukraine, which was severely weakened by the collectivization policy, the consequences of the war, and the drought in 1946, which led to a significant, though not catastrophic, decline in the crop harvest in Ukraine. The main cause of the Great Famine was the policy of the Soviet government. It is obvious that all these conditions and the harsh policy of the Soviet leadership caused the famine. With the end of World War II, the collective farm system returned to Ukrainian villages. But after that, the areas of land sown were significantly reduced. 80% of those working on the fields were women and incapacitated people.
80%, які працювали фактично на полі, це були жінки та немічні люди. Серед них були також і діти.
They also had children that they had to feed. Unfortunately, they had very little financial resources. Realizing the complexity of the situation with Ukrainian society of that time, the Soviet leadership made a plan for procurement for Ukrainian people on July 6, 1946. Nevertheless, Soviet authorities demanded bread product and began press the peasant. A lot of party workers were sent to Ukraine for this purpose. While earlier there were 5,000 employees in the grain procurement sector, later this number was increased to 11,500. Then officials began the grain drain and took away all the bread from the agrarian peasants. That's why the peasants began getting rid of not only their own grain, which was their salary for working days. The Soviet authorities took even the grain for seed, which should have been planted in the fields in 1947. Therefore, a crisis set in, and this was the beginning of yet another famine.
Тому виникає ціла криза, і населення починає голодувати.
The famine of the winter-spring of 1947 was the most terrible. The agricultural products from Ukrainian villages were sent to various regions of the USSR and abroad. 2.5 million tons of grain was exported in 1946 to 1947 to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Germany, Finland, and other countries. It was necessary for the Soviet Union to maintain its image of a superpower in global politics after its victory in World War II. That's why the Soviet Union began to provide help, especially to foreign countries like Finland, Poland, and others, which suffered from the drought. A number of grades of grain were sent abroad. Also, we know that Ukraine was the main supplier of grain and vegetables to Moscow and Leningrad. We possess many documents which confirm that all these commodities were exported from Ukraine. According to recent research, the USSR had sufficient reserves to provide people with grain products. Ukrainian historian Mykola Lazarovich estimated that Ukraine needed only 300,000 tons of grain in 1946 to 1947 to overcome hunger. That was no more than 8% of the amount of grain sent abroad by the USSR. Most of the grain was exported and the second part of the reserves was not used. According to researchers, 1 million tons of grain went to waste in the period of 1946 to 1947 on the territory of the USSR.
Як показує практика, в Україні
As practice shows, Ukraine had a sufficient amount of bread products and livestock in order to provide people and avoid such a crisis with grain.
Такої великої кризи хліба, зерна.
Based on a conservative estimate, more than 1 million people died in Ukraine during the famine of 1946 to 47. It was the time when people in Ukraine were poor and were starving to death. The leadership of Communist Poland sent its military troops for the forced deportation of Ukrainians from their ethnic territories in April-July 1947. They were resettled on the territories of western and northern parts of the Polish state, which belonged to Germany until 1945. This operation, that contemporary historians qualify as ethnic cleansing, was called Operation Vistula. The death of the Deputy Minister of Defense of the Polish Republic in a fight against a division of the Ukrainian insurgent army was the official reason for conducting the operation. The real objective of the operation was the dispersion of the Ukrainian minority among the Polish population with subsequent assimilation and transformation of Poland into an ethnic mono-state. Such a wording was used in secret Polish documents of those times. Operation Vistula was the realization of the plans of both the Polish communists and the Soviet regime. It was an insidious way for Poland to win the sympathy of the Polish population, among whom anti-Ukrainian sentiments were dominant. This situation led to a violent conflict during the war. So, what were the repercussions of this conflict during the war? Having made the final resolution of the Ukrainian problem, the Polish communists tried to rid themselves of the image of being strangers and Moscow protégés. On April 28, 1947, at 4 o'clock in the morning, 6 Polish divisions and units of the Polish Security Service surrounded territories inhabited by the Ukrainian population. They gave people only 2 hours to gather all their necessity items, and then they were taken out of their homes at gunpoint. If someone refused to leave their home, Soviet officers burned down their villages. People remained without means of livelihood in the northwestern lands of Poland, which were former German lands. There was another terrible fact. The officers tried to resettle deported people, 1 or 2 families in the village, in order to not allow the formation of a well-organized community. Ukrainians didn't have the right to return home at least until the late 1950s or early 1960s. According to Ukrainian and Polish researchers, approximately 150,000 Ukrainians were resettled over 3 months on the aggregate. Houses were burned down and Ukrainian churches and cloisters were destroyed. On July 29, 1947, the leadership of the operational group Vistula reported to its military authorities that the operation of the cleansing of Ukrainian from Polish territories had been successfully completed. Polish historian Ryszard Torzecki believes the plan for the preparation of Operation Vistula was coordinated with Moscow in February 1947. Another Polish historian, Grzegorz Motyka, supports a similar theory. No one has any doubts today that the actions between Warsaw and Moscow were well coordinated. In October 1947, the Kremlin began a mass deportation of Ukrainians from the western part of the Polish Republic to distant Far Eastern regions of the Soviet Union. 1947 was a terrible year. It was nothing short of a cruel bacchanalia in the context of deportations. In the beginning of the year, People's Commissar for Internal Affairs of Ukraine, Timofey Strokach, assured the leadership of the Soviet Union that he was ready at any time to prepare the necessary number of ranks in order that the western territory of Ukraine would be cleansed of hostile elements. The Council of Ministers of the USSR adopted a resolution on the eviction of the families of members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and active criminals arrested in battle from the western oblasts of the Ukrainian SSR to the provinces of Karaganda, Arhangelsk, Kemerov, Kirov, Molotov, Perm, Sverdlovsk, Tyumen, Chelyabinsk, and the Chita region of the Soviet Union.
І от, посилаючись на цю постанову,
Referring to this decision, the greatest deportation in the western regions of Ukraine began. At the beginning of October, the operational headquarters were created with the engagement of sufficiently powerful forces of the state security agencies and internal affairs agencies. The October period of 1947 was tragic for all areas of western Ukraine. Since October 21, soldiers of the internal troops surrounded villages, checked all houses and arrested families, not letting people come to their senses. They arrested crying children and family members of the elder generation. They allowed them to quickly gather some of their belongings and forcefully escorted them to railway stations and put them on rail cars like cattle. 50 lines of people were sent to the far eastern regions of the Soviet Union, which shipped out around 100,000 Ukrainians in 1947. These people were probably in a feverish condition after the horrifying events of 1947. As a matter of fact, such an operation required strength. I don't know how these people could survive or leave after such brutal incidents. There are a lot of reports in the archives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs that several officers committed suicide. Apparently, their psyche could not stand such a psychological frenzy. It was an absolutely terrible horror story. The destiny of those who were exiled was unenviable. These people had to overcome all their hardships in a special regime. All deportees from western Ukraine were constantly monitored by special high command officers. Meanwhile, deportations from Ukraine continued until December 1952. According to the estimates of history experts, over 200,000 Ukrainians were deported from western Ukraine from over 6 years from 1947 to 1952. After their rehabilitation, the Soviet authorities did not want them to return to their native home. The new Soviet leaders who settled in western Ukraine joined the process. They didn't want to see those people there and made all possible efforts to prevent their return.
Активніше докладали зусиль, щоб ці люди ніколи не повернулися. І виходить так, що створили на місцях оці комісії, які...
They formed special commissions which examined the expediency of returning Ukrainians. It is absolute nonsense, a complete paradox. The Soviet authorities were in need of such organizations during the period of deportation.
депортувати без будь-яких беззаконня, без законних підстав.
Witnesses of those events testified that many people died from hunger and cold while on their way to the designated places of migration. Many people also died from grueling hard labor. Unfortunately, the number of victims of those deportations remains unknown to this day. This is how the Ukrainian people went down in history. The forcible operations of 1947 and the mass famine remain one of the most tragic pages in Ukrainian history. Soviet historiography kept these horrific events top secret from the average citizen. These heinous crimes became known only in the late 1980s, when the process of democratization began in Ukraine. Today, the Ukrainian public demands from the authorities of Poland and the Russian Federation an appropriate and due political and legal assessment of these tragic events in the history of Ukraine and mankind in general.